Hello everyone, this is Danielle. I work at the Windsor Public Library. I'm a reference librarian. I'm also in charge of coordinating all of our adult programming. As you've seen over the last few months, due to COVID-19, our programming has changed. We are no longer allowed to do in-person programs for a while, so we have taken to the virtual realms. Some of the programs we've done have been book clubs, cookbook book clubs. Denise has done her Bring Your Gadgets to the Geeks virtually. And today we're going to try to start a little series of videos with Gordon Kennison, our Windsor resident gardening expert. So I'm going to turn it over to him because I don't know a whole lot about gardening. So I'm hoping to learn something too. And I hope you have a good time. Go for it.
Okay, I'm Gordon Kennison. I am a horticulturalist. I have degrees in horticulture from the University of Connecticut, as well as political science and history. So here I am at the Windsor Historical Society, where I am also a docent. Now, the reason I picked this is, one, I kind of want to plug the Windsor Historical Society. Two, they've got lots of plants, many of which I generally take care of, including pruning. And three, it's just a pretty place and a nice day to start this series that we're going to have on gardening. So hopefully there'll be other shows, and hopefully some of you will participate in one way or another. So why don't we get started and just take a quick visual tour of the outside garden area. Just get an idea of the type of thing that's down here at the Historical Society. Now remember, this is a colonial, English colonial garden. It includes an herb garden, it includes other plants that they would have used. It also has plants that have nothing to do with the colonials, but they're pretty and they're here. So we're going to learn different ways of pruning different things with the plants that are here. But in the meantime, we're just going to get a little bit of visual pleasure out of some of the things that are here. It's a beautiful day, by the way, so they look particularly good today. And we're going to start right here. This is a quince. Now, a quince is a member of the rose family, believe it or not. And so are apples and so are pears. And the three major fruit trees that are here at the Historical Society are all in the rose family. We have apples, we have pears, and we have quince. Now, I don't know if any of you remember Robert Frost, who, by the way, is a distant cousin of mine, but he wrote a poem called "A Rose is a Rose, but then I suppose that an apple's a rose, and so it goes." Well, this is true of the quince and all the others. They have many characteristics in common with each other, including, the reason I really brought it up is that their pruning methods can be very similar. Now, I don't know if you can see it very well. They're very small this year. They're healthy, but they're tiny. Normally this would be about the size of a small, well, maybe even a tennis ball. But they're hard, they're fuzzy, and they are absolutely delicious once you cook them a lot, because they're very, very hard, and you add about 400 pounds of sugar. But what the colonials did, one of the first things that they were used for in Europe and here, when I say colonials, again, I want to remember it's the English colonies, which is, I'm standing in the middle of the little spot on Earth where the English colonials came years ago, back in the 1600s. But at any rate, let me see if I can get a branch here that I can hold down. Okay, so anyway, this is the quince, and one of the things that the colonials used it for was alcohol. Because if you add sugar and so on and so forth, and you add these, it ferments, and you get what is called quince drink, which was considered to be the most delicate, most wonderful alcohol available. Hardly ever hear of it, because most people will talk about hard cider, or apple cider, obviously, pear cider, that type of thing. But it was the quince that was sought after. In fact, one colonial visitor said that it was true in England and here, you didn't have a garden unless you had at least one quince. But just to give an idea, General Washington down at Mount Vernon had hundreds of them, and they were espaliered, which is something we're going to talk about, another form of pruning. But also, what I was really starting at, but my mind wanders. This is all extemporaneous, by the way, so be patient. You all are familiar with orange marmalade, right? Well, before they used oranges, they used quince. Quince is the original marmalade or marmalade. So there you go. And the flowers on this thing, just like on apples and pears, are spectacular to look at. Not necessarily aromatic. I don't know if you ever smelled a pear tree, but it's not pleasant. All right, let's go and look at a pear tree. Now this is a pear tree. And years ago, somebody set it up. If you can see, there's a framework back there. It's sort of like a gate. And they did it as a small espalier, which is, by its name, a French form of pruning. And the idea was originally, when they did espalier, which this was never, it didn't really have enough room to do it properly. And it's obviously grown away from that over years. But there is a hint of what was intended. The bush, tree, whatever, would be grown flat against usually a brick wall. It's some kind of structure, stone wall, whatever, that was permanent. And by being flat, it didn't take up as much space as even this one does. And the idea really was used very, very well in the monasteries throughout Europe, where, of course, horticulture was a major, major endeavor of the monks. But by doing so, you could have these walls, which all monasteries had, for example, and you could have all kinds of fruit and things all along it. Again, getting back to George Washington, his gardens are lined with espalier material. So it's all compressed, it's flat, it produces almost as much as this would produce as a prune shrub, and it's out of the way. So you can utilize all of this space for something else. Now, obviously here, there isn't a lot of space. One espalier bush isn't going to make a lot of difference, but if you had a large area, you would see the difference. Now, I have recently cut this back. There are different ways of pruning pears. You can prune to produce new growth, leaves and branches. You can prune to thin it out so that branches don't overlap. You can prune so that everything is getting light. And you can also prune at different times of the year to encourage fruit production. Now, pears, apples, etc., are what they call alternate bloomers, first off. They don't bloom heavily every year. They usually skip a year or so. If there's something wrong with the weather, they may skip a couple of years. But this one, I won't say unfortunately, but what we had to do to prune was to keep it so it wasn't in people's faces. And we had to, I thinned it out so it's getting a lot of light. They also want it kept down along the level of the brick wall, because the minute you get up into the old building, you start getting into the problem of building a highway for things like carpenter ants. And one thing they cannot afford to do with a building that goes back to, somewhere in the 18th century, this particular building, no, but the materials here, you don't want to have the ants eating it at all. Most people don't want the ants to eat their house. So it's not a bad idea to prune it. And this one, I won't say I had to hack it, but I did have to cut it back a little bit more severely. You are still seeing a little bit of fruit production here. Again, it is not very numerous, and the actual fruit itself is small. And I just had one here. This may be the only one left. But when this does produce, this one little thing will produce shopping bags here, where we put in a couple of antique apples. And I would tell you the names, but every time I put a tag on here with the name on it, somebody takes it. So I honestly don't remember which one is which, but it is an old 18th century anyway apple. And as you can see, it's got a lot of fruit. And you prune apples mostly during the winter when they're dormant. One, you can see what the framework looks like. You can make sure you get rid of branches you don't want, keep ones you do. You try to keep it at a certain height. This one is grafted to be a moderate growing one. Apples are not generally grown on their own roots anymore, though some are. But they graft them onto other apples or even onto quinces and things like that to maintain some control. But I pruned this one in the winter like you're supposed to, and I did it with the intent of producing more fruit. And it actually has done fairly well this year. They're not monsters. We're not going to corner the grocery market, but they are quite something. To be honest, I've never even tasted one of these. We just put these in a few years ago. A woman with Liz Henderson, who worked here, came up with the idea, and they picked these two spots. This is only There's so many places you can put them, and there's a lot of sun. It's fairly open, and they are very, very attractive, potentially, trees. So it's really going to be quite nice. But they're young. I don't know if anybody's actually tasted any of the fruit yet, so something to look forward to. Main topic today, and it will appear in other shows as well, but it's pruning. Pruning is an ancient form, part of horticulture. I read a book once, and it was called A Dresser of Sycamores. Well, it was based on some biblical passages, but in biblical times, in biblical lands, the sycamore was a fig tree, Ficus sycamoris. And to maintain a fig tree took very delicate pruning and cutting away of things that you didn't want and maintaining things that you did. So someone who took care of the fig tree, which is very, very important, tree, was an honored person. And that, hence the name, the Dresser of Sycamores, was an honorable title. I am by no means a dresser of sycamores, but I do know something about pruning, period. For those of you, and this is a plug, maybe you can get this book, maybe you can't, but I know libraries are filled with books about gardening, and many of them have chapters on pruning. This is one that years ago was put out by Ortho, which I don't know if they're still in business. But anyway, it was specifically about pruning. So there's a lot of books out there. Reader's Digest has them, all kinds of things with chapters on pruning that are particularly good. And they just tell you some of the real basics. And one of the most basic things about pruning is, one, to have proper tools. You've got to have tools that are useful, sharp, and therefore be careful. You don't want to hurt yourself. But also things that get a job done and get it done quickly. Nowadays, of course, people go to the power tools. There's chainsaws and power this and power that. I stay away from them for a lot of reasons. One, I'm not crazy about the smell of gasoline fumes. Two, they're loud and noisy. Three, especially here in a small garden, you don't need anything that powerful. There's some wonderful hand tools that do things very quickly. Plus, a lot of pruning is very delicate. You've got to actually look what you're doing. And you're doing very specific cuts, such as on roses and things like that. And I'll show you one in a minute on that. But others, you are doing a little bit more just sort of, the word I used before was hacking, but you're cutting away large pieces. For those, you don't have to be quite as fussy. But again, in a small garden, hand tools are probably the best way to go for most people. And the most basic pruning thing is one I hope we're all familiar with. These are pruning shears. And this particular brand is extremely well made in Switzerland. And since they're not paying me any money to advertise them, I'm not even going to tell you whose they are, but you'll recognize them. They're fairly expensive. This pair, I believe, cost years ago was close to about $100 for the tool. You can get them for $3 and they'll work for a little while. These last for a long time, and the blades can be replaced. Very, very handy tool. But this will be your basic tool. Now, just to give you an idea, I have also brought, I don't know if we're really going to be able to see this, but maybe if we take let's just a long thing. It's an extension pole. It's no big, brilliant idea, but you can raise this up, and as long as you can hold it with your arms, you're in good shape. As you get older, like I am, it's a little bit harder, but if you don't extend it too far, you can still do pretty well. But you can get branches well over your head. Just make sure they don't land on your head. Always a good idea to wear a bump cap or something if you have one, if you're cutting over your head. And whatever you do, leave climbing the trees to the arborists unless you are one yourself. You don't want to fall out of a tree. My father-in-law fell out of a tree, broke his leg in 4 places. Not a good thing. So anyway, getting back to this extends and it comes with attachments. This actual one here was made in Germany, and it's a good series of tools. And what happens is all that this does is clamp into the top, and it gives you a string here to actually pull so you can clamp the blades. Why, yes, it's another form of pruning shear. It's just a little bit bigger and it's heavy. So again, trying to hold this pole up and carry the weight of this pruning shear can be a little difficult, but if you don't get up too far, or if you're very strong in the arms, it's an excellent, excellent tool. I used it just recently and realized that I am getting old, and it hurt for a while afterwards, but boy, what a great tool. Couldn't have done it without it. cleared a nice path in my own yard. Also included are what they call pruning saws. Now, one of the things about a pruning saw is the way the teeth go. And a regular saw, the teeth go one way, and a pruning saw, they go forward. So you're cutting on the downward cut. When you pull back, you're not cutting. The idea is that you don't want to push your weight too much on the cut so you don't fall out of the tree. And again, you know, they try to keep them as sharp as you can. Just cleaning it makes a difference, but they're very handy. This one attaches to the end of that. And if I said that backwards, you're cutting this way, but when you pull it back, you're actually doing the cutting. Anyway, this is similar to that. This one has an attachment, can go on a long pole too if you wanted to. A little bit bigger, gives you more blade space. A little hard to get into a bush like the quince or a tree like the quince because of the brace here, but it does give you a lot of leverage. So when you're trying to cut something, this will cut through something very quickly. And don't buy a cheap one. There are little folding ones and things that you can use. I carry at least one in my car at all times. They're about that long. You can get out, you can cut a small branch or whatever very quickly if you decide you have to do it. And they're good, but they aren't good for doing a lot of pruning at any one time. So now that I've given you that absolutely cook's tour of pruning, we're going to go and actually prune something. What a thought. Just going to show you a couple little bit of pruning techniques. Now, there's not a lot left to be done on this quince because I already did it. I did it a week or 2 weeks ago, and we had a cleanup party, and I was doing pruning at the time. But some pruning tips that are generalized for other things, excuse me, but I can show you here. Again, the tool you're going to use probably most often is the pruning shears. Pruning shears, if they're any good, can easily cut something up to an inch, sometimes an inch and a half in diameter without damaging the pruning shear or making it too hard to make the cut. The idea is that obviously the larger the diameter or whatever the material, the more strain it causes, the more tired you get using it, and you can actually do damage to the bush if you leave a jagged edge or whatever. So you want to cut what the tool is made for. The saw would be, for instance, or actually there's a lopper in between that you can use, which is a long-handled pruning shear, and sometimes with a little bit bigger blade, and you can cut a little bit more material, something maybe up to 1 3/4, 2 inches, and then the next one would be the saw, that type of thing, as you go along in size. You use your judgment and what works for you, but also the better the quality of the pruning shear, you can usually cut a little bit wider thing than you can with the cheaper ones. Make sure you keep the tool sharp, which incidentally people say, when do you prune? Well, the old adage used to be when the blade is sharp. There, that's all there is to it. Only there isn't. There's a lot more reasons as to when and how you prune. For example, as I said before, most of the apples, pears, etc. are cut during the winter because the tree is dormant, you can see what's going on, you aren't going to disturb any of the buds or anything like that. It might be growing, certain plants produce their buds the season before, some produce them, their flower buds. Right after they flower, they produce next year's growth. We'll talk about those as we go. But as you can see, there are different colors to a given branch. You maybe can't see it here because we're not using the best optical equipment available. There's no giant camera here, no giant studio behind us. But you have new growth, which is usually light in color. I won't say it's green because new growth isn't always green. A lot of people say, oh, the roses, I cut off all the green stuff. Well, that's fine, except in a lot of roses, the new growth is brown or tan or in any number of colors. But as you go back on most plants, you will see the growth gets not only wider, it gets woodier on a tree like this, but at any rate, it will get darker as you go back until eventually you're into fairly wide stuff, and then you're into, you know, actual branches. And before you go cutting off any actual branches, you really want to think about what you're doing. Cutting some off the small stuff, it's really not that disastrous if you make a mistake. Now, I'm not going to cut this because this just grew, and that was part of my intent. The intent was to keep the bush producing some quince. This was not their favorite year, but also to maintain the bush, again, because we have people here, and we have to be able to walk around it without getting slapped in the face. So with a quince, you've got one little special thing that's a little different. The thing is that on a quince bush, to rejuvenate it, true quince bush, every 5 years or so, you're supposed to cut the thing down. And that's what I did when I first came to the Historical Society. They had this thing braced up with wood and crutches and every other thing. It looked awful. And I said, well, you're supposed to cut it down. Well, they didn't like the sound of that. I cut it down. And there was quite a storm of people. They were very upset, and rightfully so. It looked barren. But within a very short period of time, what you see now before you grew. Less than a year, or 2 years I mean, less than 2 seasons, you had good, decent-sized quince, and over the period of another 5 to 6 years, you got what you're seeing now. You don't want to do that, though, unless you actually are sure that there are new quince plants coming along behind. And here, somebody put in a vinca mulch here, or ground cover, and that has kind of kept some of the growth down. I see that we have another plant that's famous around here. This is one of the tulip trees. Looks sort of like a maple leaf, but see how it's just slightly curved here. There's not a lot of indentation, no toothing or anything like that. This is a tree, and as I say, it's called a tulip tree because the flowers look a little bit like tulips, but they're big, big flowers, beautiful flowers. But the tree grows to be 150 feet tall, and not everybody has a place for it in their yard. This one originally started out growing against the building. They spread, they're in the neighborhood, and they will spread by seed and other means. But they're a beautiful tree if you have the space for it. They're, like I said, beautiful flowers, but don't be sitting under one when one of the flowers decides to drop 150 feet on your head. I've seen that happen. It hurts. But again, that's growing under there. There's all kinds of stuff growing under there, and there isn't much sign of any great new quince growth at the moment. So if I chopped it down now, it'd be a long time before you saw any more. Plus, a lot of people would come say, oh, what used to be there, and they would miss the pleasure of quince. So we did a compromise, and what we do is we try to cut it back judiciously every year and maintain comfort for people to get around, and also the health of the bush. I call it a bush. It's a small tree, but it really takes the form of a bush, which I won't get into those definitions right now. But anyway, so that's it. But just to get an idea, if I'm walking around, let's say I'm a member of the public who's over 6 feet, you know, and this is really close to the sidewalk, I might say, well, cut that out. So you go back, still on a little bit of new wood here, last year's wood back here, and you make the cut fairly close at an angle. You do the angle because you don't want things to collect on the surface. They can cause disease, especially if the angle is facing up. And that's particularly true with things like roses. That's why you always cut an angle, which we'll talk about in a second. But anyway, I just cut that branch off. And it doesn't hurt the tree any, as far as I know. And it doesn't hit anybody else in the head. And also, if people are mowing here, which is, we have a lawn, though back in 1810 they might not have. Lawns were not terribly popular. They had animals grazing in some of the yards or whatever. Quite often the area around it was just dirt. You know, down at Mystic Seaport, they took one of their older 19th century houses and they put in this most gorgeous garden. Except that the house would never have had a gorgeous garden like that. So some of the more purists got upset and said, oh, you can't have that. It's an 1830 house. You can't have a garden like that. So they let it go back to the dirt. Well, they didn't like that one either. So it's a tough thing to keep everybody happy. Now, another thing to watch out for, especially on members of the rose family, is they are subject to a huge host of diseases. They grow apples and things that are intentionally bred because they're resistant to certain diseases, and the quince is no exception in the family. So it too has its bouts with a number of diseases, and if you see anything, even discoloration or whatever, sometimes it's a good idea to cut that out. Again, going back near the stem. You don't want to go right up to the stem because you'll just open up a wound. But when you start cutting around where there's disease, you want to have with you something like rubbing alcohol where you can just dip the blade in it so you aren't spreading spores or whatever. I'm not going to do that now because what I cut out really was just one leaf that I didn't come anywhere near, so I'm not too upset or concerned. But normally when you are cutting away things, because they are ill, always good to keep that blade as germ-free as you can. And obviously we're paying more attention to things like germs and viruses right now because we are surrounded by one of the worst viruses ever. Incidentally, we are maintaining a social distance here, and we have our masks, and we do wear them when we can. It's very hard to talk with them. It's also hard to walk with them. Okay, let's go do a rose. Not that well at the moment, so we're going to do a couple of things. Obviously, plants, some are more aggressive than others. They will take over around other plants. They may actually take over and destroy other plants. This rose has been through quite a lot of abuse over the years, either being ignored, being dug up, being dropped on, but it's a lovely, lovely plant, and it would have been part of a garden. There's an awful lot of herbal uses, medicinal and culinary, and as perfume, etc. for the rose. It's a very, very special plant to have. Also, one of the most temperamental plants that you have going, so it takes a lot of care. And they are really, truly delicate things, but they reward you extremely well for taking care of it. Now, this other large plant with the very interesting flowers. Oh, it smells so good. And this one, these are Asclepias, and commonly called milkweed, but they also had medicinal properties. As a matter of fact, Asclepius is the god of medicine, and I wear an ID bracelet for diabetics, and the symbol on it is the rod of Asclepius. It's a rod with a snake, one snake going around. It's not a caduceus, it's the rod of Asclepius. Great to have. I'm not going to cut them out now. We probably will eventually. I might cut back one just to open up the rose to a little bit more light. And as you can see, some other things are growing around here with some wonderful salvia, sage. This happens to be Salvia officinalis, which is the basic cooking sage. I don't know if you're my age and you grew up and your mother cooked a turkey, she used Bell's seasoning. And if you looked at a box of Bell's seasoning, what it really pretty much is this particular plant. As I say, herbs are used for medicine and cooking as well. And what happened was, of course, they were used for the medicine, and then people noticed that some of them smell nice and some of them taste good. So that's what how that sort of went over a long period of time. Anyway, it seems like all we're doing is pruning members of the rose family, but there's a lot of them. And this is an actual rose in the genus Rosa, and plants are subdivided into species where they have two names. Then the first name is just the genus. It's a larger group of plants. Then a larger group of plants is the family. And the rose family is the family that roses obviously are in. It's usually named after one of the more prominent members of the family. Now with some plants, there's only one member of the family, such as the ginkgo tree. It's prehistoric, and it's its only surviving member. So, whereas the rose family is huge. Okay, on a rose, one of the things that you think about is that when do roses flower? Yes, they flower now. Some of them have already gone by. I know some in my yard haven't. Some are now what they call repeat bloomers, almost continuous bloomers are also quite readily available. And so you got flowers pretty much all the time, and you want to keep them clean. In this case, there are no flowers on here at the moment. I don't even see any flower buds, so this one might be done with its flowering for the year. You have to wait and see, and I honestly don't remember what kind it was. This has been here for a long time, though it's not obviously as old as the houses. But, ouch. Roses have, no, they don't have thorns. That's what you were thinking, wasn't it? They have prickles. Prickles are a non-growing vascular tissue, and if they grew, you'd be in trouble. A true thorn actually keeps growing. I've seen thorns that are like 8 feet long in some plants, such as some trees. But anyway, one thing, what you're doing now, when you cut away, you want to cut off that dead flower, if there were one. But in this case, let's just cut the plant because it's kind of getting in the way of other things and bumping, and we want to keep these all happy if we can. A rose starts out with groups of leaves quite often that are usually 3 leaves. Now this looks like it may have already been cut back. And like I said, we have a person who does take care of this pretty well. So I think she may have already done that. Is this one? Ah, here's one. As you can, maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. Again, we can't do zoom close-ups. But this only has 3 leaves. You don't want to cut at a 3 leaf because there's no growth buds around it. You want to go back to one that, and you can do any of the ones that have 5 leaves. You try to decide where you want that. You get to a 5-leaf one. Do I want to cut all the way back at a 5-leaf one? Do I just want to do the first 5-leaf one? Again, that's for size, direction of the plant, etc. But right near the area where that 5-leaf branch comes off the stem, there is a hidden bud, and you want that. So you will go back. In this case, I'm going to cut because this is just a little bit in the way, and I want to show you sort of. But again, you go down to about 1/4 of an inch or so away from where that leaf comes off the branch, and you cut at an angle. Why again? Because moisture and things collect on the tip there, and if there's an angle, they tend to drain off and air out a little bit better and less likely to get infection. So now I've cut this off. I can stick it in water, enjoy it as foliage. Rose leaves do very nicely in arrangements, just like the rose itself. And you can, go back and cut. You don't try to shape a rose bush. You try to maintain it. You don't want to make a gumdrop out of it or anything like that. They are designed to flower, and you try to encourage that flowering, and also you try to encourage them staying relatively within the space. We can get on another show, we can go more deeply into different types of roses. There are many, such as hybrid teas that most people are familiar with, species roses, climbing roses, etc., etc. Mostly all pruned relatively the same way, some differences. But this is almost surely a hybrid tea, which also dates the plant because the hybrid tea really didn't come into existence till about the middle of the 19th century. And before that, there were quite a number of known species roses, as they call them. If you remember the War of the Roses, between the various British factors and whatnot, the families identified their own family, with one of the roses. For instance, one of them for the Tudors was Rosa alba, and the white rose. So that was their emblem, their symbol. Hence the name, the War of the Roses. It wasn't really roses fighting with each other. It was guys wearing roses fighting with each other. Gotta keep that straight. So anyway, you keep pruning and watch out for those thorns. Quite often there won't be any. Some don't really produce thorns until you get way down the stem. For instance, right down here, you can't see it, but there are some real nasty ones. And you want to stay away because a rose prickle can hurt. And if you don't pay attention to it, you can even get an infection. So wear gloves. Watch what you're doing. Be delicate. Don't at a rose bush. Don't jump into it. Don't hack at it. Don't chop away at it. Hold it carefully, and you will be much rewarded for the pruning that you're doing. And as I said, we'll do more of that in other places, and when we come across another rose or two, we'll do that. To finish up here today on pruning, though there's much more to talk about and many other places to go, but that's the exciting thing about these shows. You can just ramble and talk, and there's always more to talk about. I just thought I'd do this as the last thing. This is the mountain laurel, Kalmia latifolia, named after a botanist by the name of Peter Kahn. And one of the shows we'll get into how plants are named and who named them. It's kind of an interesting story. But anyway, the mountain laurel is our state flower. And they have been working on hybridizing it for size, for flower color. They are still in search of a pure red flower. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't found that yet. People have gone to their graves coming up with pink flowers, flowers with red veins. Beautiful, beautiful plants, but not that true, pure red. They know it's there somewhere, and they keep looking for it. But at any rate, this is just the species, Kalmia latifolia. It will have a white flower with little spots inside the flower and little stamen that carry the pollen, and they will be folded like that, like a little spring. And it's really kind of neat because that's how they describe this pollen. But anyway, mountain laurels are hard to prune because the buds are almost unseeable. So we don't do too much of that if we don't have to. You try to let them grow. Obviously, if they overtake a sidewalk, you have to do something. But the main thing that you're going to worry about is that after they flower, which they have just finished flowering, just like rhododendrons, to which they are related, they leave back this sort of like a giant spider with all these legs. I hope that didn't ruin it for people that don't like spiders. Anyway, these are all where all the flowers used to be, and these will be seeds eventually. And it will take some strength away from the plant. It's not a bad idea to remove as many as you can if you've got the time, and that will give more energy. Again, though, they are alternate bloomers. There'll be a year where they almost don't flower, and other years where they're just amazing. This year they were particularly amazing. New growth is very evident because it's very light green, but there is also more new growth coming up right about where these are. By the way, they're very sticky, very sticky. Doesn't mean your plant is sick, it just means they're sticky. But there's yellow growth here and old wood here. That's, you could probably cut safely near a bump in the new wood, and that way you can clear, like I'm doing right now, the sidewalk. But the main thing is to try to get rid of these. They're unsightly, and they do take some strength away from the plant.